Hello, everyone. I think we've still got people joining, but I think we'll make a start as we've not got a lot of time and we've got quite a lot to get through today. First of all, could I just say welcome to the Clean Arctic Alliance's pre-MEPC 79 briefing webinar from COP27 to IMO action, charting a course to ambition. First of all, we've got a couple of housekeeping points before we get going. Could I have the next slide, please? The housekeeping issues are up on the slide, and I think it's particularly important that you just note that the webinar is being recorded and we will make it available after it's finished. If you have any questions, we do have a Q&A system. You can submit your questions in the Q&A chat at any point. It should be near the bottom of your screen. We'll endeavour to answer questions during a Q&A session at the end of the presentations. And if time runs out on us, we will do what we can to follow up with a response after the event. Today's Clean Arctic Alliance webinar provides a first look at a number of the issues that are on the agenda for consideration and decisions at IMO's 79th session of the Marine Environment Protection Committee, which will be meeting in about 2 weeks' time at the IMO HQ. It meets from the 12th to the 16th of December. We're going to have 5 very short 5-minute mini presentations, and then we will move straight from one speaker to the other with just a very brief introduction. First of all, we're going to hear from Dr. Lucy Gilliam, Senior Shipping Policy Officer with Seas at Risk, on how the science of climate tipping points must inform the need for IMO action. Following Lucy, John Maggs, President of the Clean Shipping Coalition, will talk about the commitment to 2030 emission reductions being key to success of MEPC 79. After John, we were going to hear from Bill Hemmings, advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance, on measures leading to deep and rapid reductions in black carbon emissions. But unfortunately, the European railway network has let Bill down. So I will say a few words in his place addressing black carbon emissions. We'll then go on to Eelco Leemans, Technical Advisor to the Clean Arctic Alliance, who will address how scrubbers are turning an air pollution problem into an ocean pollution problem. And then finally, we'll hear from Andrew Dumbrill, Clean Arctic Alliance Advisor, who will wrap up the presentations looking at how the Arctic heavy fuel oil ban could be strengthened. We'll then have plenty of time at the end for some questions and answers. As I said earlier, you can submit questions at any point during the presentations, but we will keep them all until the presentations have been concluded. So without further ado, we'll move to our first speaker. Lucy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sian. Okay, so I'm going to talk about COP27 to MEPC, the urgency and tipping points. The planetary emergency is all around us. We've seen record-breaking temperatures last week in China, devastating floods with millions displaced losing their homes, Pakistan, but also Saudi Arabia last week. We've had mega storms, we've had rivers drying up, even in Europe, ships being unable to navigate through our rivers. We've got weak economies, ongoing COVID-19 infections, a devastating war in Ukraine, and heightened inequality. It's a planetary crisis, and actually all of these things are connected. Now, our climate is changing, and these changes are already affecting every inhabited region across the globe. The headline conclusions from the first of 3 working group reports contributing to the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th Assessments Synthesis Report, which will be due to be published in 2023, carries a clear message. Human-caused climate change is unequivocal, its size and rate unprecedented, and it's already causing weather and climate extremes across every inhabited region. The second of the 6 assessment working group reports addressing the climate impact, adaptation and vulnerability, see document MEPC 78/7/18, WWF et al., draws attention to the cascading web of local, regional and global impacts within and beyond polar regions. Rapid warming and extreme temperatures in the Arctic are leading to unprecedented seasonal ice loss, permafrost thaw, and increasing ocean temperatures. There is a high confidence that increased weather and climate extreme events are exposing Arctic communities, in particular, to acute food insecurity, and that the Arctic is a global hotspot of high human vulnerability. The events, however, also impact the rest of the world, since the Arctic serves as a regulator of the global climate and of other ecological processes. We are seeing that these processes are nearing points which rapid and irreversible changes on the scale of multiple human generations are possible. The cascading changes likely over the next 2 centuries include regional warming and temperature extremes, permafrost thaw, and sea loss ice beyond that experienced in human existence. The recent report on physical science basis pulls together findings from more than 14,000 peer-reviewed studies and indicates that the Paris Agreement limits of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees will be passed in the 2030s and the 2050s respectively, if emissions don't peak and rapidly decline over the next few decades. And it warns that global heating exceeding 1.5 degrees could be reached in the early 2030s. And triggering these climate tipping points will trigger further heating. These IPCC reports and the UN Secretary General refer to tipping points. A tipping point is a critical threshold at which a tiny perturbation, change, can qualitatively alter the state of the system. So this is where a system responds in a non-linear fashion in response to a small change and altering future states. And you can think of this as, you know, you're adding to the system, heating, and you're not seeing much change, but all of a sudden a threshold will be crossed and you'll tip into a different system. Current global heating of 1.2 degrees C above pre-industrial temperatures already lies within the lower end of some of the tipping point uncertainty ranges. So these tipping points could already be triggered from 1.2 to 1.5 degrees, like the melting of the Greenland ice sheet and permafrost. Every single fraction of degree adds more risk. And in the context of this new scientific information, it's absolutely essential that we do everything we can to not exceed the 1.5 degree limit. It's a limit, it's a ceiling, it's not a goal, it's not a target. Significant policy relevant impacts from triggering tipping points include substantial sea level rise from collapsing ice sheets. Now, recent studies show that this could be in the region of 28 centimeters to 78 centimeters already baked into the system. Arctic sea ice loss will also lead to greater heat absorption from the blue ocean, further accelerating ice loss and heating. We'll also see dieback of biodiversity-rich biomes such as the Amazon rainforest or tropical corals, and carbon release and methane emissions from thawing permafrost. Another recent report from the UN called United in Science found that the world is heading into uncharted territory of destruction, and there's significant likelihood of these tipping points being crossed if the heating crosses this 1.5 degrees. We're seeing that the Atlantic meridian overturning circulation, for example, is already being destabilized. Now, by 2050, over 1 billion people will be at risk at coast-specific climate hazards, along with 7 to 14 trillion of coastal infrastructure. The maritime industry is particularly vulnerable to changes that would be triggered by the tipping points identified. Maritime industry, global supply chains and infrastructure upon which they depend are vulnerable to climate shocks, extreme weather, sea level rise, and disruption brought by heating. It is in the maritime industry's interest to decarbonize fast and early. Economic losses are increasing as these effects of climate heating worsen, with the climate vulnerable countries who are doing the least to cause the climate crisis paying the highest price. So I'm going to end my presentation now with some words from a notorious climate agitator. Who's that? Greta? No, actually, Antonio Guterres, the UN SecGen at COP27 said this. This UN climate conference is a reminder that the answer is in our hands and the clock is ticking. We're in the fight of our lives and we're losing. Greenhouse gas emissions keep growing, global temperatures keep rising, and our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We're on a highway to climate hell and our foot is still on the accelerator. So let's bear that in mind as we go from COP27 to MEPC. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. We'll move straight on with our second speaker on how a commitment to pre-2030 emission reductions is key to the success at MEPC 79. John, over to you.
Thank you, Sian. Thank you, Lucy. Every tonne of CO2 and other climate pollutants emitted from shipping counts and will only add to the climate chaos that is unfolding around us and that Lucy has just described. This is the simple, practical message that we have for MEPC 79. You need to cut ship emissions deeply now. There's no excuse for delay, and certainly no waiting till 2030 before you take off, as some in the shipping industry are suggesting. Translating this for the negotiations at IMO over the next couple of weeks, as we've got MEPC the week after next, but next week we have a greenhouse gas negotiating session, greenhouse gas working group session. So translating this for the negotiations at IMO over the next couple of weeks, most importantly, the revised IMO greenhouse gas strategy must be strengthened to make it unambiguously in line with the Paris Agreement and its limit of 1.5 degrees. The current initial IMO strategy is weak and ambiguous, and this has created uncertainty for industry and the false impression that we can wait before cutting emissions deeply. As the IPCC and others have indicated, an unambiguous commitment to 1.5 degrees means shipping must halve its climate impacts by 2030 and end climate destroying emissions close to 2040. A weak target for 2030, or only setting new absolute emission reduction targets for 2040 or 2050, as some are suggesting, is not enough and will set the shipping industry up to fail on its climate responsibilities. Next slide. Going hard and early in this way will not be easy, but it is feasible and cheaper than delaying action. One study on the table at IMO next week describes every year of delay to the decarbonisation of shipping, adding $100 billion to the total ship decarbonisation bill. And enhanced ambition must swiftly be followed by short-term requirements on the industry that drive down fuel burn in the pre-2030 period. That means bringing forward the review of the IMO's carbon intensity indicator, aligning its requirements with 1.5 degrees, and making sure ships comply and emission reductions are real. This will help meet short-term emission reduction goals, speed up the deployment of new means of propulsion and new technologies, keep the industry on a 1.5 degree pathway, and prepare shipping, and this is important, for the day when the new and much more expensive zero emission fuel come online. These fuels are going to be expensive. It's in the industry's interest to be burning as little of them as possible. What they do now to reduce emissions in the pre-2030 period will help keep their fuel bills down in the post-2030 period. And the IMO discussion on mid and long-term climate action must refocus on how to ensure those proposals, including proposals on fuel standards and carbon pricing, how they can also contribute to emission reductions pre-2030. And finally, as we move to addressing shipping's climate problem, the IMO must ensure that it doesn't create new problems along the way. There should be no more fake sleight of hand solutions like exhaust gas scrubbers, tackling an air pollution problem by creating a water pollution problem. You'll hear more about this later. In this regard, we're particularly concerned about the potential environmental impacts of some of the new fuels that are being talked about. In tackling shipping's climate problem, we also have an opportunity to clean up the industry more generally, and we should take it. Finally, and none of this should happen with a clear focus on the need for adjustment. Those who are getting us into this mess will need help, and the shipping industry can and should provide it. Thank you, Sian. Back to you.
Thank you, John. As I mentioned earlier, our third speaker was due to be Bill Hemmings, but he is stuck on a train in Germany. So I'm just going to talk briefly on action to reduce black carbon emissions from ships. Measures to reduce black carbon emissions have been under consideration by the IMO for over a decade now. And unfortunately, we have lost the opportunity that we perhaps had to gain some breathing space, which was envisaged in 2010 when 3 countries, Norway, Sweden, and the United States, submitted a proposal for a programme of work on black carbon. To have any hope of staying within the 1.5 degrees C Paris Agreement limit, we need to start reducing emissions now, and addressing black carbon, which is a powerful short-lived climate forcer, should be low-hanging fruit. We don't need to develop new fuels, nor new technologies. We just need to make better choices about the fuels that are used and to scale up the technology that has been used on land-based transport for a considerable number of years. A switch to lighter distillate fuels for ships operating north of 60 degrees north will significantly reduce emissions by between 52 and 79%, depending on the type of engine, the condition of the engine, the load, and some other factors. And it will allow the installation of particulate filters, as used by land-based transport, to see emissions reductions of over 90%. It is a simple and effective approach, a fuel switch coupled with existing technology. After all, switching fuels is already commonplace as ships enter and leave emission control areas. So none of this is new. It's not rocket science. It is action that can and should be taken in the short term. Next slide, please. To make sure this happens and to happens quickly, we need regulation. We already have an IMO resolution, MEPC 34277. It was adopted just over a year ago, but it is voluntary. And we are calling for that resolution to now be developed into a regulation and adopted. An amendment to the MARPOL Convention, Annex 6, Chapter 3, to introduce a specific requirement for ships operating in and near to the Arctic to use lighter distillate fuels en route to decarbonisation would be a major first step. And we would like to see MEPC 79 give the go-ahead for exploration of a new regulation next year that would apply north of 60 degrees north. The work could then be undertaken during the coming year by the Pollution Prevention and Response Subcommittee. In addition, emissions of black carbon coming from ships further south will also need to be addressed. These reach the Arctic and are deposited onto snow and ice too. MEPC 79 is due to adopt a new SOx emission control area, or SECA, for the Mediterranean region, which is very welcome. And the designation of emission control areas, both in the Arctic and further south in European waters, would be valuable in efforts to reduce climate forcing black carbon emissions, and also in reducing health impacts too. This, of course, is provided that ships do not circumvent the emission control area requirements by using ultra-low sulfur fuels or scrubbers. We need black carbon or particulate matter emission control areas, which require that only cleaner fuels be used. And I'm going to leave it there for now. But please, can I just remind everyone, if you have any questions, and I can see we've got one in already, if you can, please indicate to which speaker the question is being directed and submit it via the Q&A Zoom option at the bottom of your screen. We'll move on to our fourth speaker now. Eelco Leemans is going to address scrubbers in more detail and how scrubbers have turned an air pollution problem into an ocean pollution problem. Eelco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sean. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So yes, scrubbers. For those of you who don't know what scrubbers are, scrubbers were designed to address air pollution, specifically from SOx emissions in the around 2009 to cut SOx emissions to the air. And it was sort of meant as an alternative to cleaner fuel. And so when these scrubbers were designed, it was envisioned that the residue that is produced by the scrubbers would be delivered, discharged in the port or so in a safe manner. But in fact, scrubbers have turned out to become your typical end-of-pipe solution for an environmental problem. And over the years, the use of scrubbers as an alternative for low sulfur fuel has increased really rapidly, and now at least 5,000 ships with scrubbers. These scrubbers produce a sort of seawater mixture containing all kinds of substances like PAH, heavy metals, and of course SOx, etc. And typically the solution or this discharge overboard. And the scrubber discharge volumes, they range now between 210 and 4,500 million tons per year in the Baltic Sea and the North Sea alone combined, and about 47 million tons for 2020 along Canada's Pacific coastline. So we're speaking about a huge amount of this water. And the wastewater, so what I said, contains toxic substances such as PAH and heavy metals, causing serious impact on aquatic ecosystems. And this is not, this has been researched by universities and notably by ICES, which has noted that, you know, there's a huge amount of these substances being put straight into the ocean as your typical end-of-pipe solution. It is not the way forward. I would like to see the next slide, please. So what's interesting is that what we found out, and which is also in the document for MEPC, which has been submitted by the NGOs, that the IMO regulation on scrubber seems to be inconsistent with the United Nations Law of the Sea. And not just UNCLOS, but they're also inconsistent with UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So this is a specific problem for people, for indigenous people, for instance, in the Arctic region. So what we believe that there should be a prohibition of scrubbers, which is called EGCS, the exhaust gas control systems, and thus eliminating the wastewater, which is coming from the scrubbers, and also eliminating spill risks posed by HFO and reducing black carbon emissions, because ships that have installed scrubbers, they typically use heavy fuel oil. So a switch to distillates would be by far the best solution for the short term. And a switch to distillate, as Sean just mentioned, also reduces black carbon by 40 to 70%. So that would be the best option for the short term. So, and as I said before, a ban would also resolve outstanding conflicts between MARPOL and United Nations instruments, such as the United Nations Law of the Sea. Now, and for the short term, until a global prohibition on exhaust gas emission control emissions is introduced, then we really need local and regional measures to be implemented to restrict the discharges of these types of equipment. And this is of particular importance for the Arctic to protect critical habitats, indigenous use areas, and protected areas. So the basic lesson is IMO has created this end-of-pipe solution, and now there's 5,000 ships equipped with this, but it's not too late to start prohibiting this type of equipment and get on the right track to cleaner fuel, to start with distillates, but of course in the end it should be all fossil-free fuel. Now next week, Clean Arctic Alliance on the 6th of December will organize a webinar that is purely based, dedicated to the story about scrubbers. So keep information of this on track, and hope to see you next week then. Over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Eelco. And we will put details of that webinar up on the screen at the end of this session. Our final speaker today is Andrew Dumbrill, who will wrap up the presentations, focusing on how the IMO can strengthen the Arctic heavy fuel oil prohibition. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Sean, and thank you, Eelco and John and Lucy, and to you too, Sean, for pitching for Bill. I think there's a strong, or we've been making a very strong case for short-term actions. And I think the HFO ban and strengthening it is clearly one of those concrete short-term actions that IMO member states can take in the next year. The IMO ban is coming into force on July 1st, 2024. However, it's not a ban at all. It'll mean the threat of an HFO spill to community livelihoods and harvesting and to the Arctic marine environment will still be there after 2024 because of some of the loopholes that have been written into the ban. And just to put a point on that, only 30% of HFO carried and 16% used in Arctic waters will be prohibited as of July 1st, 2024. So you can see that's not a ban at all. And the ban clearly doesn't respond to the original intent, which was articulated in the AMSA report over 10 years ago, which identified fuel spills from ships as one of the major threats to the Arctic marine environment. Next slide, please. Fortunately, there's a solution here, and it's to strengthen the ban and to pull out that option of issuing waivers, which Russia was part of advocating for so strongly during the negotiations of the ban. And I think some of you may have seen media reports recently about Canada and Russia and some concerns about their implementation of the ban, and particularly Russia, who originally called for this clause to be put in, is now dragging its feet on its implementation of the ban. I think IMO member states have to take note of that dynamic for sure. Other states like Canada, I think there are some concerns about the implementation. Canada doesn't have a domestic plan yet. 2024 is fast approaching. Lots of legislation needs to be put in place to rid the Arctic of, the world's dirtiest and most hazardous fuel. So we're really, signaling some caution and the need for those state implementation bans to be put in place. But the IMO can address this waiver issue by pulling it out of the text of Regulation 43A of MARPOL Annex 1. The IMO can do this quickly, and it can make a substantive difference. Over 50% of the ships in 2019 would be eligible for that waiver if a state decided to grant it. So that's a big difference with the ban. So IMO states can make that happen. And NGOs have put forward a paper 79.14.1, which outlines this issue and calls for the waivers to be removed. Outside of what the IMO states can do on this, Arctic states can also act. And we've seen, for instance, Norway has done that by banning HFO in some of their state waters near Svalbard. You've heard about the emission control areas that pushes the shipping industry to cleaner fuels and the use of distillates. There also is a need for states, and this is particularly true in Canada, to look to federal transition funds, which would ensure that Arctic communities aren't burdened with any potential increased costs. As we've heard from Lucy, these communities didn't cause the climate crisis, and they are on the front line of the climate crisis, and they shouldn't have to pay to clean up the mess that the rest of the world has created. So there needs to be innovative ways like transition funds to ensure that communities aren't impacted. So just to wrap up, the NGO paper 79.14.1 articulates what's possible here about removing waivers from Regulation 43A of MARPOL Annex 1. It's possible, and we can do that within the next year, and we can, remove one of the biggest threats to communities and the Arctic marine environment by strengthening the HFO ban. Thanks very much. Over to you, Sean.
Thank you, Andrew. And before we move to the Q&A segment, can I please just thank all of the speakers during this webinar. Really appreciate all your inputs. We have one question already submitted. Please, could I encourage others to put questions now, if you've got any in your mind, into the Q&A function, or if you're struggling with the Q&A function, please do use the chat as well. That's also an option. If you can indicate who your question is directed to, that would be even better. But don't panic if you can't. Just get the questions in there, and we'll work out who best to address them. We have a question already from Claudio. Sorry, I'm going to need to put glasses on to read it better. It's imperative. Sorry, I'll just read the question out quickly because I think there's a few people who might like to respond to this. It's imperative that we don't limit the focus to CO2 only, but extend it to all greenhouse gases. The push for ammonia bears a hazard of intolerable amounts of N2O being released into the atmosphere that are currently not addressed by its supporters. It's too dangerous to make policy uninformed without acknowledging the risks of the use of ammonia as fuel, which should be assessed through independent and transparent research. I know this is an issue that has been of concern to the Clean Arctic Alliance and to speakers here today. So I'll hand it over. Lucy, I'm sure you'd like to jump in. Andrew, you might too. If anyone else wants to, just let me know.
Yeah, I'm happy to start answering, and Andrew can also contribute. Yeah, this is really important. We must make sure that we're not only focusing on CO2, and in fact, in our advocacy at the IMO and in the EU, we've been very clear to say that we need CO2 equivalent measures, and we need to be taking the full life cycle analysis, like looking at a 20-year climate forcing potential of each kind of climate heating greenhouse gas or particle. Now, a big focus for us has obviously been on black carbon. So this is these soot particles from incomplete combustion that are really accelerating ice loss and permafrost thaw in the Arctic. But, we have also been working with colleagues who have been advocating for the inclusion of both methane and nitrous oxide to be in those metrics, as these are also very potent climate forces. So on the question of ammonia, we also share those concerns. It's very important that if it is used as a fuel, that we do understand the nitrous oxide that's not only produced by incomplete combustion or from leaks, but also from the risks of spills into the marine environment, where ammonia can be transformed also into nitrous oxide in the environment. We are also concerned about the risks. We must make sure that any new fuel that comes onto the market is safe, not only for the workers on board that are handling the fuel, but also workers involved in either bunkering or in port operations, and for communities that are living near ports. So we need to make sure that we fully address like the entire kind of operating ecosystem of bringing new fuels to the market and for use in shipping. So agree that it's very important that we do our homework before we scale these fuels.
Thank you, Lucy. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks. I think Lucy hit many of the main points. I mean, the life cycle guidelines need to include black carbon and methane and CO2 equivalents. I think there's also another question on LNG and how what the interplay is with the HFO ban and kind of the unintended consequence. I think it's clear that, you know, from a 20-year global warming potential, LNG is not a climate solution, and in some cases it's worse than marine gas oil or distillate fuels, and so it's clearly not the answer in the short, medium, or long term. The problem with seeing it as a short-term solution, LNG, is that it locks in infrastructure, which creates a long-term solution. And so we need to avoid that lock-in of infrastructure. There's also clear studies about retrofitting LNG vessels and how expensive that is, and how investment in LNG prevents investment in a true zero emission decarbonization pathway for the industry. So LNG doesn't work on many levels, and especially when we're talking about short-term solutions. So I think that's you know, the interplay with LNG, and you know, the short-term solution now is switching to cleaner distillate fuel, which is available, which ships don't need any retrofit costs, maybe some tuning of the engine and lubrication to fully use distillate fuel. The infrastructure is there; it's available throughout the world. And if you fit on a diesel particulate filter, you can even bring down you know, black carbon emissions even further. And on the spill risk, I should say that it's been shown that you know, HFO spills are 3 to 4 times more expensive than diesel to clean up. So you are making some gains on the spill front with distillate fuel. It's still a fossil fuel, right? And we need to get off it in the medium and long term, but there's a viable solution there, and it's clear that LNG doesn't fit into that a current solution space around black carbon or short-term solutions. So I'll leave it there and pass it on.
Thank you, Andrew. John, maybe you could pick up on both that first question, John, and possibly the question on LNG that's come in from Ellie as well. I'm just conscious we've now got quite a few questions and we're going to run out of time very quickly. So I'm going to move people on quickly if possible, please. Thank you.
I'm happy to kind of link these things up a little bit as well, and I can be quite brief. I think there's we've talked about scrubbers, and LNG's come up now, and there's been mention of ammonia. And, I think all of these things are linked in a certain way, because, the scrubber debacle, and that's what it is. I mean, it was scrubbers were, the IMO's determination to give the industry a range of ways of tackling sulfur has, completely undermined its own, aims and objectives around protection of the marine environment. So, the scrubbers, and to a, in a different way, but, similarly, LNG is also a cautionary tale. I mean, LNG was never about climate. It was originally about air pollution, and when all we were concerned about was human health and air pollution and acid rain, then there was a place for LNG. But as soon as you're decarbonising, of course, there's no place at all. And the industry still seems to think that LNG is part of a climate solution when it patently isn't. So I think these are all cautionary tales. And I think what they tell us is that the IMO and governments have got to be much better at resisting the siren calls of little parts of the industry that have got products to sell, whether that's gas or exhaust gas cleaning systems. These things really shouldn't have been given any truck at all during the negotiations at IMO, but they're with scrubbers they were, and now we're in a big mess. With LNG, people are increasingly believing it's part of the climate solution, and that's going to end up in a bigger mess. And to link this to ammonia, we don't know at the moment whether ammonia is an appropriate fuel, and we need to tread very, very carefully and make sure that we don't rely on material from an industry pushing ammonia and ammonia technologies. We need to step back and take a cold, hard look at not just its climate implications, but the other potential hazards to the environment, because we don't want to get into another situation where we think we might have solved it, but actually, my God, that's a disaster. So I think these things are connected, and they tell us a little bit about I think some of the cultural things that perhaps need to change at IMO and within transport ministries in order to get real, genuine, long-term solutions to the shipping industry's problems.
Thanks, John. I'm going to move us on quickly. There's a couple of questions around HFO. Andrew, are you able to come in? One from Nora on how quickly the IMO can change the HFO ban and exclude waivers, and also what percentage of HFO in the Arctic is in Russian waters, from Anna Rose. I can come in as well and help on those in a moment, but you start off.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Nora. And I think it's a good one. Things take time at the IMO, and amendments take time. So what sometimes is perceived as a short-term solution ends up taking a decade. I think what's clear, though, is that Arctic states can embed the current IMO ban and not include the waiver option. And so that can be done fairly quickly. I think an amendment to MARPOL would take a bit more time, but it would be globally comprehensive, right? You'd get more bang for your buck if it was global and not a kind of a piecemeal state approach. But there is a backstop there with states. States don't need to include the waiver option within their national regulations. And I think the next question from Anna Rose, I think, this really, it points out, the global conundrum, right, about global action versus state action and what happens to the commons, right, outside of the exclusive economic zones. It really makes the point about how IMO and IMO member states and setting strong global regulations is important. The shipping industry is a global business, and those international voyages often come under the purview of the IMO. So the HFO ban at the IMO clearly needs to be stronger, and the loopholes need to be closed, and states need to work at closing those loopholes, so we can finally get the world off heavy fuel oil and on to talking about, you know, zero emission fuels, and you know, a true zero emission pathway. It's kind of, you know, it's difficult to be still talking about heavy fuel oil after all these years, and talking about a switch. It's extremely frustrating, but it still is something. It's an action that IMO states and Arctic states can take to clean up this aspect of the shipping industry. Maybe Sean, if you want to comment any further on that.
Just very quickly, because we're running out of time. I mean, yes, the biggest percentage of ships operating in the Arctic on heavy fuel oil are Russian ships, and the biggest percentage of those are operating in Russian waters. However, only those that operate with Russian flags in Russian waters would qualify for waivers. So any ship traveling from Russia to another part of the world, or from another part of the world to Russia, would not be able to use heavy fuel oil. It's not a perfect solution if Russia decide not to implement the ban, but it is at least a step towards getting HFO out of the Arctic. And we still obviously need to address the bigger problem of stopping HFO use altogether. People are always surprised when you explain that actually what we're trying to do is to get ships off a fuel that has been banned on land for many, many years and moved on to a fuel that is currently trying to be banned on land. And actually we want shipping to move to that because that's better than what they're using. Anyway, I'm just going to a little bit of luxury if we can, and just take one more question here. Eelco, aimed at you, I think. A question about scrubbers from Stephen Lowe. Has research identified which ports in their respective communities suffer the highest negative impacts to local water quality?
Okay, thank you for a very interesting question. And there is research, more research coming out. For instance, University of Antwerp and ICIS have done quite a bit of research on the impact of scrubber wastewater and what it does to marine ecosystems. But currently there's no overview. But just one example, the Baltic, the whole of the Baltic is suffering a lot from wastewater from scrubbers. So that's not a small ecosystem like a port area, but it's a huge sea area, and that alone, banning scrubbers in the Baltic and in the Arctic Ocean would be actually a first step that needs to be taken very fast. And so sometimes when I discuss this with people in the shipping industry, they say, well, this was promised to us, we were promised that we could use these scrubbers. But then I say, well, it happens a lot that at a certain point, a decision that has been taken that was a wrong decision, and you have to get back to the decision and say, we've learned a lot now, so we have to change that, and we have to go follow the right path, and maybe that means that you have to go for cleaner fuel, so that's what we're aiming for, and it has to be done. But as said, on the 6th of December there will be more on scrubbers.
Thank you, Eelco. And there's one question that we skipped over, but I did type a reply. Gabriella was asking if there are any links to the studies that have found that immediate action is cheaper than delaying action. And there are 2 papers submitted to MEPC 79 that address relate to that question. INF 29 and INF 30, and I believe that they're publicly available, those papers. So if anyone's got trouble getting hold of them, let us know. John, just quickly, if you would like to jump in.
Yeah, very, very quickly indeed. I mean, the numbers that I quoted and that are in those UK papers, this $100 billion a year is the cost to the shipping industry of the additional cost to the shipping industry of its decarbonisation per year. It's not a figure for climate damage as a result of delaying climate action. Those numbers are much, much bigger again and something completely different. So I just wanted to make sure that there was no confusion around that. I mean, I think it's extraordinary enough that, a year's delay, or, each incremental year's delay should actually end up costing the shipping industry those kind of figures. That's really quite something. But I just wanted to, make sure that everybody was, crystal clear about what those numbers meant.
Thank you. As I said at the start, unfortunately, we've run out of time and we must conclude. And as I said at the start, it's our intention to make the recording of the webinar available, and the details will be circulated probably tomorrow. I don't think it'll be possible to get them around today. I'd just finally like to thank once again our speakers, Lucy, John, Eelco and Andrew. And also, I'd like to thank all of the participants. We couldn't run these webinars if you didn't choose to join them. So thank you for joining today. And as has been said a couple of times, if you are interested, we have another webinar next Tuesday at 3 o'clock UTC. And Dave has posted the registration link in the chat. So please do register for that if you're interested. In 2 weeks' time, MEPC 79 will be in full flow, and we will be back in person at the IMO HQ. For many, it will be the first time, I think, back at the IMO HQ for a meeting since 2019, though I think a few were probably present earlier this year. I hope that everyone will be able to participate in these important discussions, and that there will be good support for stronger measures to address greenhouse gas emissions, black carbon emissions, scrubbers and scrubber discharges, and the use and carriage of heavy fuel oil that will provide the Arctic, its wildlife and its communities with the protection that it so urgently needs. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing many of you again next week. Thank you.